Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the history of the neurodiversity movement. My name is Ira Idle, and today we're going to talk about the formation of Autreat. Timeline-wise, we are still in the early 1990s, though we are approaching the mid-90s and almost the late 90s, but not quite with today's episode. So to recap from the last part, since this is part 2 of the history of ANI, Jim Sinclair, Donna Williams, and Zinnia Grant met in person. There were parents of autistic kids who sought their advice. Jim developed spaces that were by and for autistic people, and that included the pen pal list of Autism Network International, and then it eventually became an organization. Existing autism organizations would not advertise ANI when they were asked to. ANI grew over a few years. Autistic people met each other in online forums and in person, most notably at autism conferences. And then Jim presented at the Autism Society of Ontario's 1993 conference with Don't Mourn for Us. We left off at the Autism Society of Ontario's 1993 conference, and here we're still there right now. There's still more to talk about with regards to that particular conference. So Don't Mourn for Us was a big deal for a lot of autistic people. It drew more people to the ANI exhibit. And then after this event, ANI started to grow to the point where not everyone knew each other anymore. And ever since then, the autistic community and neurodiversity movement, very much the same thing has happened. It used to be a lot more close-knit than it is now. The conference also brought a new concept to the ANI community. So there was somebody who approached Zinnia who was not autistic, but he had a disability known as hydrocephalus, which deals with excess liquid in your brain. He had been active on the forums, so plenty of other people knew about him, but Zinnia wasn't that active on the forum, so she didn't know him yet. He described what it was like to live with hydrocephalus to Zinnia, and then she thought about it for a second, and then warmly exclaimed, "Cousins." And that became a common term in ANI, autistics and cousins, ACs, also just autistic cousins, people who weren't autistic but had very similar experiences to autistic people and had other disabilities. I think this was before the term neurodivergent had been like a thing. Cassiana came up with it when she was in high school. I'm not sure if she came up with it before she was active in the autistic community or not. She wasn't active until the late 90s. But I think most autistic cousins were people who were neurodivergent, but not necessarily autistic. So people with ADHD, people with Tourette's, dyslexic people, etc. Then came the Snore Wars. So there was this email listserv. So this was before the World Wide Web was really a thing. The internet was in its infancy. Most interactions online were through email, and you could group together people's emails on email lists that were known as listservs. Those are still a thing nowadays, but they were like the internet back then. Nowadays, there's social media and things like that. Um, So there was an email list that was maintained by parents of autistic people. So you also got to keep in mind internet access was a lot more limited back then. It wasn't a near guarantee like it is for most people now. And it was expensive and kind of rare for people to host internet to host their own servers, their own email lists. So autistic people for a while had to rely on these parent-led forums to be able to stay in contact with each other over the internet. So there was more autistic people joined this server. It was specifically the St. John's Autism listserv. I'm not sure if I already said that, but there were neurotypical members who did not like this, saying that it wasted bandwidth. It was that kind of stuff was a lot more limited in the early internet than it is now. Though the thing is, autistic people should be able to communicate with each other on an autism forum. There were some parents who supported autistic people, but others didn't. And this resulted in a flame war. And flame war isn't really used nowadays. It was used more in the early internet days. Flame war is basically a big argument online. And it was the reason why it's called the Snore Wars was because it was a playful conversation Jim had with a friend about his snoring overnight at a conference. And they had a lot of back and forth emails with one another, and other people on the email list started to get really annoyed by that. And there were also just tensions that had been rising for a while, and this was like the final straw. And Jim just kind of, as he said, I've had enough with this. I'm making my own email list. And that email list was ANIL. Now, I think the L simply means like listserv. A lot of email lists had that L at the end of it back in the early days of the internet. So there weren't public internet sites that hosted email forums. Most email lists, most listservs were maintained by colleges and universities at this point. So there was somebody who created a listserv on an academic server for ANI. This forum launched in the fall of 1994, and it lasted until 1996 when it got moved to Syracuse University's server. Jim Sinclair was a faculty member at Syracuse University, so Z was able to use their institutional power to create a forum that was by and for autistic people. However, this was the first time ANI took a sponsorship from a non-autistic source, that being Syracuse University. The central rule, as I've alluded to before, is by autistics for autistics, and that's become a central principle of at least the autistic side of the neurodiversity movement. That it's important for things about autism to be by and for autistic people, or at the very least to meaningfully include autistic people in the devising process. They had to establish a new set of rules to follow. At first, the forums were only open to autistic people and ACs. Once non-autistic people were allowed in, they had very strict rules to follow. There were 2 parents and 1 professional who joined as moderators of other parents and professionals. Had they just been general moderators, that would have created the same power imbalance that happened on the St. John's server and on other servers too. The forum was then divided into main channel, AC, and parents auxiliary. Now, this wasn't meant to segregate by neurology, but more so by content. And then there were 3 more sections added later: disability rights, conferences, and virtual party. Now, I actually have some insight on what virtual party was from a long-time autistic self-advocate Cal Montgomery. He told me about how virtual party worked. So it was usually on a Friday night. A bunch of autistic people would agree to have these email parties where they would send each other a bunch of emails at once, almost as if they were on an instant messenger. So they would notify people of it ahead of time so that the people not participating could mute the channels, and then they just had a bunch of fun typing whatever and sending his messages. Cal DJ'd these events. And now it wasn't the traditional kind where he actually played music. He would type in the lyrics to songs as emails. So I think that sounds really fun and really wholesome. Uh, it sounds like it was a great time for the people involved. Cal told me that it was the first time he had really felt like he was an extrovert. He had gone his whole life up to that point thinking he was an introvert, but then he realized he was an extrovert. He just needed to be around people who actually got him, and Jim Sinclair was the first person to really understand him, or maybe not the first person, but Z understood Cal's neurology and was able to create an environment where Cal could truly thrive socially. So the section division made the parents anxious. There were parents who would sometimes post in the AC section, they would get redirected. And there were some autistic people who were uncomfortable with what professionals would post. So the boundaries between the AC and PA sections became more clear over time. I think that's natural, just as when anything develops, that boundaries just become clearer as participation continues and things happen. The second main method of communication was a printed newsletter among the ANIL members. More people started coming to ANIL as a safe haven from the public forums about autism, that most of which were not led by autistic people. And now there are many different autism forums, groups, you name it, that are both by autistic people and not. I think there's a lot more variety now than there was back then, especially in the autistic-led side of things. And we're gonna get more into other autistic discussion groups in later episodes, in later parts. But for the ANIL was like the first significant one, really. So in November of 1995, somebody approached Jim about having an autistic-led section of their conference where autistic people would plan. It would be a whole like part of the conference dedicated just to autistic people at their neurotypical-led conference, where autistic people could give presentations, where they were in charge and all that, where autistic people would be the main audience. So this became an ANI project, and details were discussed on ANIL. And from this conference, the name, what specific organization it was under wasn't specified in the history of ANI, but there were some things that became staples at Autreat. Those being crash rooms, communication badges, guidelines for neurotypicals at conferences, and the idea of a self-narrating zoo exhibit. Now, so the color communication badges are things that you wear on your chest. That the color of it's like a traffic sign. It shows what your level of comfort is with with talking to people, with socialization. So at first it was just yellow and red. So yellow would be only people you know should approach, and then red being that nobody should approach. So you're just not in the mood for conversation. They later added green, which meant anyone can approach you, and you might actually need other people to help start a conversation. And these communication badges have become pretty commonplace. Just at a lot of autistic events, and even at just some general disability events. I've I went to the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network's 2019 gala where they had these communication badges, and I was also part of the Autism Campus Inclusion program, which was virtual because of COVID, but we were mailed the communication badges that we were encouraged to use. I think they can be very helpful, even just in settings that aren't specifically for autistic people. Um, because I mean, I think everyone has varying levels of conversation readiness. I don't know if I'd say readiness um, of willingness to socialize. And of course, with autistic people, it's very specific, especially when it comes to like spoon theory and all of that. So this conference had some good news and some bad news, mostly bad news. So the good news was it was great to have autistic people involved in the creation of a conference. The bad news was that it was still not their conference. They weren't really in charge. And I wasn't at planning meetings, even though they had been promised to be. And this also included decisions about their section that they were told they would be the ones planning. The organizers did not treat the ANI members fairly. One of the organizers told Jim that the event was only for high-functioning autistic people. However, at least one non-speaking autistic person and his family attended anyway, so it didn't entirely work. ANI's contributions were not properly recognized. The ANI members were more united against the organizers than they were with the Snore Wars. There was a bit with the Snore Wars. There were some people who were more on the side of the parents, or who were who didn't necessarily agree that there needed to be a separate email list. With this conference, it was more that there was more of a consensus that yeah, they treated us like trash. Uh, so Jim did not want to partner with them again after the abuses they all faced. Non-autistic people shot down autistic people who wanted better treatment, which, as I think, as I discussed in the previous part, was something that often happens, and I think even nowadays, actually, I know nowadays that still happens. I think non-autistic people tend to, when they want to involve autistic people with something, it tends to be conditional, where they'll only allow an autistic person to uh, work with them or like speak at their conference or be on the board of their organization if that autistic person will agree to their rules, and that creates an imbalance of power where they can, if an autistic person says or does something they don't like that perhaps is something a lot of autistic people agree with, then they have the power to say, okay, I'm done with you. You're not furthering my agenda. So because of this, all this and more, it was time to create their own autistic-led conference, Autreat, which is a combination of autism and retreat. So they had to find a space, a where. They had a what, they had a why, they needed a where, a when, and a how. So they searched for a place that they could have to themselves. They didn't want it to just be for autistic adults. They also wanted children to be able to go to this so they could meet autistic adults. They thought that an outdoor space would be better than just one building. So they found a summer camp with hiking trails, woods, a pond, and a swimming pool. The first Autreat took place in August of 1996, lasting 2 days. So almost exactly 25 years ago. About 50 people attended, and they met at the same camp until 2000, and then moved campuses. They moved locations several times, and they even were on college campuses a few years. and future Autreats went from 2 days to 4 days long. So the camp itself, they have all the brochures and programs for the Autreat conferences, at least for most of them, are available on the ANI website. So the camp itself was a 4-H camp. It's now called Camp Bristol, but I believe it was Bristol Hills, but I believe it was called something else at the time. So here it is. I think it's advertised as a wedding spot. And if you look up, there's a video of Autreat from 2000 when they were still at this area. So you can see some video of it even from there. So it was in Canon. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right. Canandaigua, New York. So it wasn't in. I think I might be able to show you from this map here. So Canandaigua is like, okay, so it's kind of close to Buffalo. It's near Toronto, Canada. It's not where the 5 boroughs are. So like New York City, that includes Queens, Brooklyn, Manhattan, all those other great places. It was pretty far away from those parts of New York. It was like New York actually does have some rural campground kind of land. It's not just all city. That's just the 5 boroughs. Well, maybe not just the 5 boroughs, but that's like what is, that's the New York that you see the most in movies and television. So anyway, so the kinds of people who attended Autreat in 1996, so most of the attendants were from the United States or Canada, which makes sense geographically. There were a few international attendants. I think there were some off the top of my head, I know there were some from Japan, Israel, and the United Kingdom. And here was a quote from one of the international attendants, Wally. Again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right. Wally Wajtowigs. He said that here people could paint and draw equally shared experiences with those who can't hold a pencil or a brush. People who are very articulate equally shared experiences and understood those who could only jump or clap their hands or point to letters on a letterboard or picture board to respond to a question. The kinds of presentations that were at Autreat. The first year, all but one of the presentations were by non-autistic people. In the years following, at least half of the presenters each year were autistic. So autistic people were the primary audience, unlike at the autism conferences held by non-autistic people, where there were autistic people who attended, but the majority of the people in the audience were not. This was not the case here. This was a role reversal of sorts in that regard. So if you were a non-autistic presenter, you had to be careful as to how you spoke to the autistic or about the autistic people in the audience, because you were outnumbered for once. Autistic people wanted presentations about the good things about being autistic, the disability movement as it relates to autistic people, functioning as autistic people, nothing about cure, prevention, or overcoming autism, and no self-narrating zoo exhibits. So I didn't really explain what a self-narrating zoo exhibit was back in the other slide. So a self-narrating zoo exhibit is a term Jim Sinclair came up with to describe, and I think like this applies to autism, but I think it also applies to other disabilities too. When autistic people and people with disabilities get asked these very intimate questions about their lives by non-autistic people who are curious, or non-disabled people who are curious as to what their life is like. and it's called self-narrating zoo exhibit because it gets to the point where you're basically like a giraffe at a zoo, telling the visitors, this is how I eat grass, this is how I drink water, this is how I sleep. Um, eh, so yeah, that's what a self-narrating zoo exhibit is. I personally am quite a fan of the term. I think it's pretty neat. So the social rules and norms were that you're not expected to act normal or behave like a neurotypical person. The only inappropriate behaviors are ones that harm others. Social interactions are voluntary, and as denoted with the color communication badges, and opportunity but not pressure. I really like this principle, opportunity but not pressure, where there are events for you to go to, there are people you can interact with, but none of it is something you're obligated to do. I think in school this is like obviously you're like expected to attend class every day, or if you're on a vacation you're expected to go out and do something every day you're there, unless it's like a beach trip. But the thing is, a lot of autistic people don't have the energy to do all those things and will sometimes need time to recharge. So it's best for them not to, for there not to be like the untold expectation that, oh, you have to do everything or you're just wasting your time here because I know I can speak from personal experience. I tend to have low energy and I need a lot of time to recharge, even when I do something that I like or I go to something that I'm excited about. I will need some time to recharge after that. It's as I mentioned earlier, spoon theory. I have only so many spoons I can give to something every day. And I know, like, when I studied abroad in Ireland, I was expected to go to all these things and do all this stuff. And I got to the point where I was extremely fatigued and I legitimately just, like, needed to take some time to myself. Um, and I wish opportunity, but not pressure, had been more of a thing there. So I could take some time to myself to recharge because it doesn't mean I'm not interested in being there or that I'd rather be home. It's just I can only do so much without feeling fatigued. And I think a lot of other autistic people feel similarly. Freedom from pressure and expectations. The absence of pressure and expectations at Autreat can be overwhelming at first. This is not what the people there were used to. It was like for once it was actually an autistic space, where there were just all the other autistic people here at once who were in charge and everything. Uh, and that lack of pressure made people actually want to socialize more, which I think makes sense. I think a lot of the time when something isn't an obligation, it can then it feels more fun. I guess it feels more like something I would want to do, if it's something that I don't have to, I guess, if that makes sense. And there were a lot of people who felt that Autreat was a homecoming from them, that they had, I guess, finally come home to their home planet. There was a workshop at Autreat 1999 about this concept, about a diaspora that autistic people experience. Now, I think it's interesting that the word diaspora is used because diaspora is, I think most people know it in terms of race and ethnicity, and I guess it doesn't always, diaspora doesn't always necessarily happen just with people of racial and ethnic groups, but I do think there is, like, it's not exactly the same as, say, African diaspora, but I do kind of get that, like, yeah, a lot of autistic people aren't necessarily born together. We find each other from living. Um, And there's a very specific experience that I think comes with being autistic. Of course, not all autistic people are the same, but I mean, we're similar enough to share a diagnosis of autism that yes, there are going to be similarities. We are going to get each other better than non-autistic people will. So I I think that I think that makes sense. I just think if one is to consider it a diaspora, by the way, that Phil Schwartz was the one who was the speaker at that event, of that workshop. I think you do need to be a little careful because, as you're going to see in later parts, there are instances where there are false comparisons made with other oppressed groups and movements and social movements that I like get the idea behind, but I don't think are necessarily like it's healthy comparisons, if that makes sense. So there was a dining hall that some people ate inside of, and others decided to eat outside because it was quieter, I guess, and it was just better for them. But there were several empty tables because a lot of people gathered around a few of them. People were that invested in talking to each other and making those connections. Uh, so decompression and reentry. Many autistic people needed to know what to expect ahead of time. A few autistic people at Autreat each year felt disoriented by the change in social norms, and that would lead to them just bashing neurotypicals and just acting like autistic people are inherently better than neurotypicals, which is just as harmful as saying that autistic people are inferior to neurotypical people. So leaving Autreat would make several attendants feel withdrawn for a little bit because they just had this like overwhelmingly positive experience, or just this experience that they hadn't felt before in their life, where like they're they feel like they finally are in a world that makes sense to them or with people like them, and then they have to just go back to normal everyday life. I think that same thing is felt at a lot of retreats and a lot of these kinds of events where you go away from your normal life for a few days, and then perhaps learn some new things and change as a person, and then you have to go back to what things were before, and it feels weird. And there were some attendants that found ways around this, like they would either like get there before the conference started, or they would stay a little bit afterwards to ease themselves more gradually back into their normal lives. But it sounds like Autreat was a really important and necessary thing. And so to summarize these two parts, so Autism Network International grew from pen pals to an international community. The autistic members of ANI had many common experiences. They had in-jokes, terms, and expressions among themselves. And Autreat went from 1996. It wasn't every year, but it was for the most part annual. It went until 2013, and now a similar event is held in the same vein as Autreat, known as Aut Space. It's now held by the Association for the Autistic Community instead of ANI, since ANI has disbanded. And there's also Autscape in the UK, which has been around for quite a while. So the next Autspace is being planned, to be determined. Phil Schwartz, who I mentioned earlier, is, I think, in charge of that, and he said that they will resume doing it when COVID dies down. So I mean, my guess is with the variants and stuff, it's not gonna really go away for a while. So I don't know if it's gonna be like only vaccinated people can go or not, and I guess that ask Phil about that. But So I know that, like, yeah, Autreat seems like it was really cool. I have read stuff about, yes, there was conflict at Autreat. It wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. It wasn't perfect, because nothing is. But the things about it that are good are were really, really good. And I know for me personally, I would give anything to go to something like this. I almost got to with ACI, and I guess it was virtual, so I still sort of got that autistic space, but it wasn't in person. And there's a huge difference to that. I mean, yeah, because of COVID, I wasn't able to, and I'm hoping one day we'll be able to meet up in person. I did get to go to the ASAN Gala, where I did sort of get that feeling of, yeah, autistic people are running the show. They're the ones in charge here, and they're like, these are well established autistic advocates all around me, and it was a great feeling, and I really loved it. But it was only one night long. Um, So I'm hoping I get to experience stuff like this again, and I think a lot of autistic people would probably also love to experience this if they haven't already. And I think there is a lot of value in autistic space, and I think it's vital and something that most, if not every, autistic person should get to experience in their lifetime. So, some things to think about as we go forward. In what ways does the history of ANI show what has stayed the same and what has changed in the 30 years since? The history of ANI is not well known, even by many autistic people. Why do you think that is? What kinds of autistic people do you think were not seen as commonly in Autreat, and why do you think so? So, that's all for today. I think I'm gonna briefly show you the email discussion that started the Snore Wars. Uh, I'm just gonna kind of leave these here. So they're talking about this guy named Steven who snored, and then they just, like, Jim and Ray Kopp, they they just kind of they joke um, about what's going on, and it sounds like Jim and Steven were slept in the same room. Uh, and yeah, here's just them joking with each other more, and it's yeah, and then eventually, so here's the one. Here's where Jim said, "All right, I've had enough." So somebody was asking for autobiographies named Tom Brock, and then Jim said, "I think, like, Jim had just reached a breaking point. It was like, this is not an autistic-friendly forum. Autistics and cousins are not welcome to communicate with each other here. We're speaking only when spoken to by neurologically typical people, and only for the purpose of providing informative data for others' purposes, like self-narrating zoo exhibits." Uh, and I think, yeah, there were a lot of people who, like, agreed. Other people who weren't as aware of what was going on. So yeah, I guess I'll. This is all publicly available, so I'll link to it in the description. But yeah, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.